to view a few days after the meeting on Council's website and YouTube channel. The cameras will film and record councillors at this meeting. However, care is taken not to film or record images of members of the public. If a member of the public asks a question or makes a comment about an agenda item, they will not be filmed, but their voice will be heard in the live stream and recorded. Please also note, in accordance with Council's local law, that this meeting cannot be filmed or audio taped unless permission is granted by the Chair. In the unlikely event of an emergency, please follow instructions of the Chief Warden. Apologies. Councillors, do we have any apologies? I believe we are all present, so there are no apologies for tonight. 2. Minutes of previous meeting. Councillors, the minutes of the Planning Committee meeting held on 22nd of August 2018. Are there any questions regarding these minutes? No. If not, can I have a motion to confirm these minutes? Councillor Voss, seconded Councillor Pearl. I now put the motion. All those in favour? That motion is carried. 3. Declarations of conflict of interest. Does any councillor have a conflict of interest in a matter being discussed at tonight's meeting? No. 4. Public question time. We have no members of the public who have asked to speak at public question time this evening. 5. Councillor question time. Councillor, are there any questions of the officers? No. Then we shall move on to item 6, presentation of reports. I'll now move to item 6.1, which is 156 to 162 Thistlethwaite Street, South Melbourne. We have one person who has asked to speak to this. That will be Tim McBride Burgess on behalf of the applicant. Tim. Whenever you're ready.
Good evening, councillors. As mentioned, my name's Tim McBride Burgess. I'm a Director of Contour Town Planning Consultants, and I'm here on behalf of my clients, Thistlethwaite Street Proprietary Limited, the owners of the subject property. I will be brief. The application itself, as I'm sure you're well aware, proposes 12 townhouses. These are 3-bedroom family-style townhouses, 6 with roof terraces, 6 with balconies. There's 1 car parking space proposed for each of the dwellings. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak and also to confirm that I'm here in support of the officer's recommendation and the conditions that have been put forward in the officer's report before you tonight. Our position is simply that this is a high-quality proposal, a well-thought-through proposal, townhouse proposal for family-style accommodation. It's entirely what the zoning provisions and the strategic framework plan are suggesting would be appropriate in this location. It's been put together by a reputable architecture firm, MA Architects. They're a firm that's well known to this council. They've done a number of projects within this council over the recent years. The proposal itself responds to context, and there's some imagery in the council report showing and demonstrating the quality of the architecture and the design itself. It's essentially been put together to deal with a transition location. We've got an existing industrial use immediately next door to us, a bakery. We've got some residential properties immediately to our south, and the architectural style that's been adopted is one that seeks to transition between those two forms, one more robust and one more permeable, being the residential outcomes. The application itself has also been refined during the application process, and we've worked with the officers. They put forward some suggestions to us through their urban designer, all of which were adopted, including some changes to the car parking provision. We did originally seek to provide for more car parking spaces per dwellings than what is the case now, but we accepted that that was not what the strategic documentation was suggesting would be appropriate for this particular location in Fisherman's Bend, and we've made those changes to deal with that recommendation. So on that basis, I'm simply here saying that we think it's a good proposal, and we hope that you endorse the officer's report that's put before you tonight and the recommendations that have been put before you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? Councillor Voss.
Thank you very much for coming in and speaking to us. Just wondered if you would have any objections if we were of the mind to request that the architect be retained as part of the permit.
Absolutely not.
Thank you.
Councillors, are there any other questions of the officers? No. Councillors, we have an officer's recommendation before us. Do we have someone willing to move the officer's recommendation or an alternate motion? So I might ask that someone else moves it on Councillor Brand's behalf. I've been told the Bachelor's on tonight. Some of them want to get home to watch that. We could be here a while. I'll take that. Moved by Councillor Voss. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Brand. Councillor Voss, would you like to speak to this motion?
So, through you, Chair, I am moving the alternate motion.
Thank you. If you'd like to read out the changes to the original officer's recommendation.
Thank you. So, it's an addition to the end of the report. So it'll be number 33, and the addition will be ongoing involvement of the architect, that the applicant must retain MAA Architects Proprietary Limited to complete the design and provide architectural oversight of the delivery of the detailed design as shown in the endorsed plans and endorsed schedule of materials and finishes during construction, except with a prior written approval of the responsible authority.
And Councillor Brand, you're okay to second that? Councillor Voss, would you like to speak to your motion?
Thank you. I have to agree with what the applicant said. This is a good quality application of 12 three-bedroom townhouses that each have one car space, with quite a number of requirements on the permits for stormwater, woodwood, stormwater harvesting, that sort of thing. So it's in an area that is 4 stories and it complies to that area. I'll be speaking. I'm obviously in support of the application.
Councillor Brand, would you like to speak to your motion?
I'll give it a try. Do you think is that actually legible? What I'm saying, okay.
So husky.
Yes, just excuse me. I think it's a really important thing that we add this, not just to this particular application, but in principle to future applications when they come in, when they are in particular quite spare and minimal designs like this one. They depend very, very heavily on the execution, the detailing, the materials, the idea that the architect has to be carried through to the end. Otherwise it will be a failure. And I think I think in this case it's just a good example of that. I'm very pleased that you're happy to do that. It's just insurance against that practice that it so often happens, that you get a reputable or a really good architect, developers get one in, and then when they get the application, they're out the door, and somebody comes and does, is just there to sort of detail it up in a very meagre sort of way. It's bad practice, and it actually goes against the confidence that we have that it'll be a good finished product. So anyway, I'm very happy to be doing it here. It was just I don't think it was all that necessary, but your architects are very good architects, and I think it's just important to establish that as a principle.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Would any other councillor wish to speak? No. Councillor Voss, would you like to close? No. In that case, then I put the alternate motion. All those in favour? Carried. Item 6.2, 355 Barclay Street, Elwood. We have 4 people who wish to speak to this. I'll call upon the first speaker, Mr. Peter Husek. If you could take a seat up the front, state your name and suburb. Yep, just take the chair there. Turn the microphone on. That's it, and state your name and suburb. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, my name is Peter Husek and I live at 357 Barclay Street, which is right next door to the property development at 355. So I'll just wait for the handouts to be distributed first, just for a second. Okay, I'll get a start now. As I said, my name is Peter Husek. I live at 357 Barclay Street, Elwood. And what I want to do in these few short minutes is highlight the following main points regarding the development. First point is neighbourhood character. Second is overlooking and privacy. Third is heritage overlay and the scale of the development. And 4 is the fact that I just state that I do agree with the council report recommendations that have been put together for this development. Going to the second slide, I've got an aerial shot there which basically gives a context for where this property exists. It sits on the corner of Lawson Street and Barclay Street, probably 3 or 4 houses up from there is Jerry's Milk Bar on the corner of Meredith Street. This development sits right inside a heritage overlay area, probably one of the most significant heritage overlay areas within the Elwood precinct. And I also want to highlight down the bottom of that slide there that this development has occurred over a long period of time, that it did go to VCAT in early 2016, in fact February 2016, and the VCAT decision in the summary did emphasise the importance of the heritage overlay for this area, and it also emphasised the need for some reduced intensity or mass and scale of the property that was being developed at 355. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a subsequent slide. Slide 3, I just wanted to give people a feeling for the types of properties that exist around the surrounding development. If you have a look on slide 3, I've given some examples in Barclay Street of some typical kind of Edwardian properties. The one on top left photograph, that property there on the right-hand side of that is my property at 357. You can see the properties in Lawson Street, similarly Edwardian-style properties, single storey. The one on the top right-hand side, you can see Barclay Street, some of the typical types of properties. And you'll notice on that top right-hand photograph in Barclay Street that there has been a number of properties that have developed extensions in that area, but they have all kept the facade, the original facade, and the extensions really from a street level are very difficult to see. So they've been put together very well, been managed by the council very well. They're pretty invisible as you walk along the street. So the whole area, the whole heritage aspect of the area has been retained. And probably there's 3 or 4 on each side of Barclay Street. It could be close to 8 properties which have done that kind of thing over the last 5 years. I'll go to the next slide, slide 4. This relates to the second point. What I want to emphasise is one of the major issues we had with the current set of plans was, if you look at the plan that I've included on that slide, there is a brown shaded area in the bottom left-hand corner of that plan, and that's a decking area. And you sort of say, okay, that looks okay, you say to yourself, but when you start looking at the stats, that decking area, because it's in a flood-zoned area, the internal floors, as I've nominated there, are at 1.2 metres high above ground level. and the outdoor deck that I've got marked in brown there is 0.8 metres high. Now, on the right-hand side, what I've given is I've tried to give people an understanding for what the scale of that height level is. And that height level, you can see me standing at 1.2 metres high on a ladder there, looking over my 2 metre high fence. You can see the issue, the definite issue of privacy, both for my property and for Lawson Street as well. Going on to slide 5, I've only got 2 more minor slides left. The third point that I want to highlight is the heritage look and size issues. Now, on slide number 5, on the top view, you can see Barclay Street, looking from Barclay Street, and the second one on the bottom, Lawson Street view. You can see the view there. You can compare the Edwardian houses, the shapes of the roofs. They're different. They're kind of not really heritage style, that you would say. And as I've nominated there in a comment, the roof shapes are very different. Colour bond, I just want to highlight, colour bond is used on the top and bottom floors there. So you can see the dark grey areas with the vertical slats on it. That's colour bond. Now, I personally don't believe that that really exudes a heritage look. I think if we're going to say that this is a significant heritage area in Elwood, that we would be wanting to have materials that are more heritage-like or similar to heritage, give that heritage feel. And also the roofing structures, I must say, there's not much sympathy with a sort of classic heritage kind of Edwardian style roofing structure. The last point on this slide 5 is that from the VCAT of 2016, one of the main points in the summary of that decision was the scale and size of the development. We must remember that Lawson Street is only a very small street. There's only about, on the side that this development is on, there's only another 4 properties in that whole street. It's a very thin street, so that needs to be considered in terms of building something of this scale as well. And finally, on slide 6, I just wanted to again reiterate that the report put together by the council, and there's a number of points which are included in that report. I agree with the council recommendations, and I hope that can be passed from my perspective as a resident. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Husek. Next speaker is Michelle Tardini. Thank you. I think the microphone's already on there. If you could just state your name and suburb. Thank you.
Hi. Good evening, councillors. My name's Michelle Tardini. I'm 63 years old and I've grown up in Elwood. My children grew up in Elwood, my parents and my grandparents. So I'm a long Elwood resident. I'd just like to say that we're not anti-development whatsoever. My daughter's a master's student at Melbourne University doing architecture, so we've seen thousands of plans over the years, so we know what we're looking at. I'd just like to draw your attention to compare the development at 363 Barclay Street, that's on this one here. This proposal is just a few doors up from our house, and it is more sympathetic to the local neighbourhood for the heritage overlay, the roof profiles and materials that align more closely with the heritage style. The reason this aligns more to the heritage look and feel is very simple. The owners requested this look from the architect. It's that simple. If you buy a house near an airport and then want the airport closed down because of the noise, that's your problem. You shouldn't move near the Elwood RSL and then complain about the noise. So why would you buy a house in a heritage overlay and then expect to pull it down and build something modern? I don't understand. The next thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the car congestion in Lawson Street. Probably no one here knows that Lawson Street is one of the smallest streets in Elwood. The reality is paid experts make a decision that the concentration of cars in there is fine. The reality is when the White Elephant was built, that's the property on the corner of Lawson Barclay Street, the locals call the White Elephant. It's one of the most ugliest buildings in the area. It actually has 2 properties in it. One property is rented out and is like an Airbnb illegally, so we have to put up with all kinds of rubbish day and night. And the other property has something running there day and night as well. So they don't use either of their driveways for anything other than rubbish or someone living in a car in there. And they live in cars in the street as well. Everybody in the street parks on the pavement because you can't get a facility of a fire truck or a rubbish cart down there. The next photograph was taken only a few weeks ago when the property in question, which is the property beside us, which is at 355 Barclay Street, caught on fire for the second time. You can see quite clearly that the fire truck could not get down the street. This is because there are 5 cars in the property on the corner and there's 3 bedrooms. The property behind that, there's all manner of cars. This new property is going to be built. It's got 3 bedrooms with supposedly 1 person living in it. They won't be able to park their car in the driveway because the driveways are too skinny. You can't get your car around. So people park in the street. We park in the street because everyone from the canal to our house in Lawson Street does not use their backyard driveway or their shed because they can't get their cars around easily and of safety. All the lanes are dark, they don't have solar lighting in them, so why would a woman coming home at night or anyone go down a dark laneway, push the button, drive their car in and then expect no one to be behind them? People park in the street. It's a real problem. It's a problem all over the area. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that. And lastly, the view from Jerry's Milk Bar, I would like to just show you that Jerry's Milk Bar in your document called the Elwood Review 204 to 220 said, I quote, Jerry's Milk Bar is of historical, aesthetic and social significance to the city of Port Phillip. So you allowed this building here, the White Elephant, to be built there. I'm just pleading with you, please don't make another mistake and put another big building that is out of context in this area. It's the only section of Elwood that doesn't have development from Lawson Street to actually the canal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have you got a question, Councillor Gross?
You agree with Council's report?
I think the Council's report's fantastic. They've done an incredible job. I'd just like to thank them for it.
And that's because of the amendment of the plans in 3.3?
If they've done an incredible job, I commend them, really. And also, I'd just like to say that the Monash study called Swamp that was done has done I think it's been fantastic. It was the best thing that's been done as well.
So you feel that the conditions have gone as far as they can to protect you from the issues that you've raised in your presentation?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Enoch McKay. If you could, I think the microphone's on, if you could just state your name and address.
I'm Enoch McKay. I live at number 1 Lawson Street, which is down the other side to Michelle and Peter of the proposed residency. We're opposing the proposed development, and we certainly do also agree in principle with Matthew Spencer's conditions to the plans, especially with regard to the removal of the deck at the rear of House 2 and relocating it to the front of the property. To reiterate the reasons behind this in agreeing to Matthew's conditions, it's due to the fact that the proposed deck enabled residents to look into our entire living room, into our kitchen, and even more disturbingly, into the 2 bedrooms of our 8 and 11-year-old children. We also agree with further reducing setbacks along Lawson Street, so I just wanted to make sure that was clear, and we appreciate those recommendations. We still object to the overall length of the built form, as we believe it hasn't changed from the previous proposed development that was rejected by VCAT. At the time of the VCAT ruling, it was clearly stated in their decision as being a major issue and concern to the VCAT member who made the report, and he stated clearly that he would like to see it reduced. As with the VCAT ruling, our opinion in this matter has not been made lightly and nor without careful consideration, and we only hope that this time around the developers at 355 Barclay Street respect Council's decisions and the very valid reasons behind them. So thank you all for having a voice in this matter.
Thank you. Councillors, do we have any questions of the officers? Councillor Crawford.
So there's a couple of, well, the first question I'd like to ask is in reference to Mr Husak's mention about the feeling that the colour bond and some of the roofing is not a good response to heritage in the area. Heritage is not my strong point, so could you enlighten me in terms of do you feel that it has responded, even though it does seem to be quite different in shapes and material?
Thanks, Councillor Crawford. Essentially, council officers would defer to the advice that we've received from Council's Heritage Advisor, who was supportive of the overall concept and the design, including the materiality of the proposal. I think it's important to recognise that the Council's heritage policy encourages contemporary design, and rather it seeks to provide responses that reference the heritage fabric rather than mimic it. So again, I would defer to the Heritage Advisor's response, who was essentially supportive of the application.
Thank you. Before we take more questions from councillors, I think we're still yet to hear from the applicant, Mr Paul Little, if you could come down. Apologies, Mr Little, your name was at the top of the list and I got to the bottom of the list and asked for councillor questions, so accept my apologies.
Thank you. Good evening, councillors and officers. My name is Paul Little. I'm a town planning consultant speaking on behalf of the permit applicant Bojan Simic Architecture, who made this application. The site, as you've heard, has some history in terms of planning applications. There was a previous proposal on the land for 4 dwellings of 2 and 3 stories. That proposal was determined by the tribunal and refused by the tribunal. Those circumstances lead to somewhat of a challenging situation for a designer when you have planning scheme controls which are clear, but also the intricacies of a VCAT decision that provided some fairly clear guidance in relation to what would be an acceptable outcome. And the first principle of the VCAT decision that was found to be acceptable was the demolition of the building on the land. And that was predicated on the position adopted by Council's building surveyor that the building was structurally unsound and had engineering support for that proposition. So that then takes us to a long-standing challenge within the policy framework of the Port Phillip planning scheme around achieving design excellence. And in the circumstances of this current application, our client has chosen to engage a well-renowned architect, a local architect, who's designed some wonderful dwellings within the municipality to consider the findings of the tribunal, put together a scheme for 2 dwellings and design that building so that it takes on a modern appearance, an appearance that lends, however, from some of the key design aspects and elements of the surrounding residential form, and that includes pitched roofs, articulated facades and so forth. And the design, if you've taken the time to read through the extracted comments from Council's urban designers, has been broadly supported by the Heritage and Urban Design referral comments within the report and indeed within the detail of that referral comments. So in relation to this proposal, the recommendation has gone to some length to look at some rather intricate design changes to address a number of issues, and in particular issues around amenity implications for adjoining properties. Those conditions have been considered quite carefully, I think, in relation to the southern interface to 2 properties for which there's been representation this evening, and make recommendations for changes that, if implemented, would go a long way towards addressing issues of overlooking, in particular, towards the adjoining properties. And those conditions are understood. We're in a process of reviewing what those conditions mean for the proposal, but they are conditions that can be achieved in circumstances where that resolution, or where the council is fine tonight that in favour of those conditions. So that, I think, brings to a summary position the position of the permit applicant in relation to this matter. We thank the officers for their hard work in relation to preparing the report and the recommendation, and we thank councillors for their consideration of the matter this evening.
Thank you, Mr Little. Councillors, do you have any questions? Councillor Brand.
Yes. Mr Little, I hope you can understand what I'm saying. There's been a lot of this version is obviously quite a substantial downsizing from the previous ones, and it's been achieved, I think, very well, and it's almost arrived at the point of being almost a hybrid sort of presentation of a hybrid between a one-storey and a two-storey building, which I think is clever. I just want to ask you about probably the biggest condition of the deck from the back to the front of the, I guess, the westernmost unit. I want to ask you the design integrity of the current of what you've presented, what you've applied for, is very reliant on those two gabled forms, one which is sort of facing Barclay Street and one which is facing Lawson Street at the end of the property. They play off each other very nicely, and I think the whole design would disappear if that gabled form down Lawson Street disappeared. But I'm worried if the living room area slides to the back of the house, can that upstairs gable form be retained in the design, or does it slide back into the big horizontal box and just become lost?
Through you, Mr Chair, that is the nuance of the conditions that we need to work through, Councillor. The condition itself, as I read it, deals with essentially sliding the ground floor towards the southern boundary, which, when one reviews the plans, appears to be a relatively simple response to remove the deck area from the southern side of that living and dining area. In terms of what that means at the first floor, I suspect that's going to require very careful consideration by the architect. We have discussed already the implications that would have for the deck area, if you like, going north. There is a fair amount of merit in the idea of positioning the open space on the northern aspect for daylight purposes. Equally, there'd be a need, I think, for an overhang of some sort to provide some solar protection for the ground floor living and dining area. So those two elements combined suggest to me that there'll be a push and pull, if you like, around where those positions sit. Whether the first floor is retained exactly in its current alignment is probably a question for how the design works, but there'd be no intention from departing from the contextual roof element that is presented along Lawson Street.
Councillors, are there any further questions for the applicant? That's a no. Councillor Crawford? No? No. All right. Thank you, Mr Little. Councillors, are there any questions of the officers? Councillor Brand.
Can I ask the officer if the architectural intent is to maintain that first floor gable element as a big solid element, is there any need to put a few extra words on that particular condition to ensure that it isn't significantly diminished? Or do you feel confident that it won't be significantly diminished?
Through you, Mr Chair. Hello. I'm confident that the architect can retain that gable end roof, and that's the intent. There's no mention in the conditions that roof form is required to change. We've heard from Mr. Little that he feels that the integrity of the gable end element can be retained. So I am confident. We could add some wording to ensure that gable end is retained.
Like, such as so that the gable form is not significantly diminished, or something like that,
or that it's retained in its current form.
Well, he did say a bit of push and pull, but a little bit of push wouldn't matter. But it's got to retain that three-dimensional presence.
Yeah.
Do you have a question, Councillor Brand?
Yeah, well, yes, I'm asking the officer if there is a form of words that we could add easily, without controversy, to this one, just to ensure that is protected in the process.
Yes, we could add words saying something like maintaining the integrity of that gable end element facing Lawson Street, and that could be included. Just a tick.
I can't find it. I've lost it. Oh, I know where I am.
That could be included as part of condition 1K.
Councillors, any further questions for the officers? Councillor Crawford?
So there was also a reference to narrow driveways, which I'm assuming was from the previous big white building. So can I ask, have our planning schemes increased the width of driveways? Because again, knowing the kind of way that we need to move into the future around people owning less cars and not being able to get stuff on the parks on the street, are the current guidelines, have they changed to allow enough width for people to use their driveway? I mean, their off-street parking. I just want to check, or is that, or they've remained the same over a long period of time?
For you, Mr. Chair. The standard dimensions of driveways in the city has actually been reduced, trying to balance providing off-street parking access and maximising on-street parking opportunities. There is, however, some discretion in those standards to allow increased width if, for example, the street itself is quite narrow and there isn't the ability to achieve a standard turning manoeuvre. But the trend has been to go down to a narrower crossing in recent years.
Councillors, are there any further questions for the officers? There being no further questions, do I have a mover for the officer's recommendation or an alternative? Councillor Brand.
Move an alternative motion. Or do you think I should just do an amendment to it? I don't know. I'll move an alternative motion with exactly the same as it is, with one half sentence added.
If you could read out your change.
That would be great.
No, through you, Chair, can I read that for Councillor Brand?
Yes, I suggest you do.
Thank you. So 1K will have an extension to the end of it. Above natural ground level, comma, without significantly diminishing the 3D integrity of the gable form above it.
And we could just get that up on the screen to ensure we've captured that.
So that possibly could extend it to, say, three-dimensional rather than 3D.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Would you like me to read it again? Read it again. So that's 1K. It says above natural ground level, comma, without significantly diminishing the three-dimensional integrity of the gable form above it. Full stop.
Councillor Brand, does that reflect, the new condition C reflect as your alternate recommendation?
If the officers are happy with that, I'm happy with it.
So that's not quite as I read it. If I can say, diminishing the three-dimensional integrity.
Sorry, yeah.
So between the and integrity, can we put three-dimensional, please? Gable.
Could be gabled. Could be. It's better as gabled.
So request to put a D at the end of gabled, please, as well.
Councillor Brand, does that reflect the condition you would like included?
Yeah, you don't need the brackets 3D, but that's fine.
Do I have a seconder for Councillor Brand's alternate recommendation? Councillor Simic. Councillor Brand, would you like to speak to your motion?
I would. I think the architectural success of this building is very, very heavily reliant on those forms, those two forms, and with all the slicing and dicing that we are asking the architect to do on that, I think it's important that we also, which are very important to do, but I think it's also that it's important that we keep our eye on the main game of making sure that this is a building that actually sits comfortably in the street and responds to its context. And I think the success of that is very, very heavily dependent on those particular forms.
Councillor Simic, would you like to speak to this?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to everyone who's come and spoken about this tonight, and thank you for the endorsement of the officer's recommendation and the suggestion by Councillor Brand to amend it slightly before we go forward. It's a very difficult decision to make, taking into consideration everything that's been said, recognising, of course, that VCAT's already made the decision that the existing building will be demolished, so we are looking at a new structure in that area. The sort of decisions we have to make with respect to heritage are difficult ones to make, and we're not looking for something that will replicate what's there. What we need to look for is potentially something slightly different. What's been proposed is slightly different with the requirements that the officers have recommended for the application. I think that potentially we can work towards a good outcome, and of course the decision we have to make tonight has to be within the planning scheme. So I thank the people who've spoken on this issue tonight and endorse the recommendation as it currently reads. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Simic. Would any other councillor like to speak? Councillor Crawford.
So thank you to the officers for this. Are we discussing the recommendation or the amendment? Just one thing, words. Okay. So I just wanted to thank everyone coming to speak tonight. One of the key things that we need to change is how people get around this municipality, because everyone having more than one car per household is no longer feasible, and we're getting this again and again in planning situations. And I know how difficult it is, given that Elwood is the least serviced by public transport in the municipality. So I know that I will be supporting this decision. I know that it's not easy for developments to come in, but I do think it is a good response, much better than the previous, to the space. I do want to acknowledge that we will be moving towards changing how we look at parking and permits, and people will have to start using their garages as car spaces, not as places to store their rubbish bins and their excess thing, because they will no longer be able to, at some stage, as we work through this, be able to just park on the street. I do want to mention to residents, we do have a process in place where if you get a certain percentage of residents in the street, you can look to get parking restrictions or hours, so you can change the unrestricted thing. That process is already in place if it's something you wanted to pursue at the moment, especially if there are Airbnbs happening and they're taking up spaces all the time. So that's currently now, but we are looking to the long term. How do we encourage people to only have one car per household, and you share cars and all of that, but it's not happening yet. It is the change that's coming. So that's all I wanted to say in regards to supporting this motion.
Councillor Baxter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I participated in a planning consult with a number of the objectors and the applicants a fair few months ago, and really, what I was struck by was the willingness of a lot of the objectors and the applicant to actually discuss some of these issues, which you don't often see in planning applications. I think where we've ended up has actually come to a pretty good compromise solution, given what we've looked at in the past. I know that there are a lot of residents who are very upset that the property is going to be demolished, and there are a lot of objectors who are quite sure that it doesn't need to be demolished, but unfortunately that's not even a decision we're really able to make tonight. So I think that given what we've been able to do that I think the planners have done an excellent job in working with the objectors and the applicants to come to a report here, that a recommendation that I think will work. I think in particular the deletion of that deck from the back and moving that to the front was probably the biggest thing in my mind that I felt should be resolved in some way, and I think this report resolves it in a pretty good way. But I'm certainly also happy to support Councillor Brand's very slight addition about wanting to maintain those gabled sort of looks. I understand that it's difficult to try and pay homage to a type of heritage style without attempting to make a mockery of it, which is what I think is the attempt here. So it's not a perfect application. It's not terrible. It's a good compromise. I'm happy to support it.
Councillor Gross.
I'm going to speak against this application for two reasons. First of all, on the question of demolition, there is a sort of a presumption that the question of demolition has been decided, and it may well have been decided at the last VCAT hearing, but in fact no permit was issued at that hearing, so I think we're entitled to talk about demolition again. And demolition, to my mind, is something that we control for heritage reasons, and our heritage controls have a couple of gaping holes that allow people to demolish all too frequently those buildings that are part of the historic fabric of this city. And one of the holes is that the hole on whether it's safe and reasonable to maintain the current structure. So, yes, it looks bad for my argument because there has been some degree of legitimate attack of the structural soundness of this building, but any of these buildings can be saved given the right expenditure. It's just really a matter of what is a reasonable amount of dollars compared to the compared to the outcome being pursued. So I think this is a question that I have to delve into personally. I'm not convinced on this case, and I feel that, you know, given the first couple of lines of this planning committee report, that I have the opportunity to talk about demolition, and that's what I'm doing, and I'm not satisfied that this terracotta roofed part of Barclay Street should be demolished. Secondly, there's the question of how do we represent the historic fabric that was once there after it's demolished. And so we've got a roof form which seeks to mock on one side, well not mock, but draw from the surrounding roof forms some inspiration. But it sort of doesn't work for me, particularly because it's as I read it, the elevation from Barclay Street is really quite severe and doesn't in any way, to my mind, reflect what I think is needed to be another word in the sentence that is the heritage forms on Barclay Street. It's boxy, it's made of a completely different fabric, and these roofs, without using terracotta, really won't be seen as a reflection of what was. It'll just be merely a gable there that's been stuck on by an architect, and I don't think that it will really keep uninterrupted the heritage of that part of Elwood that I have grown particularly fond of and attached to, and has been recognised in many heritage studies as worthy of preservation. So for those two reasons, I'm unhappy, not happy enough to speak for approval of this. Sort of have to note with admiration some of the submissions from Peter and Michelle, which were very pragmatic, very realistic, and quite fair. So, like, I congratulate you for that, and in the same way, I congratulate our officers for it goes down to, what is it, V, condition V, so there's heaps of conditions, and the assiduousness with which our officers have sought to protect our residents is fantastic. But I think they and other people in this room are much more pessimistic than I'm allowed to be on the question of demolition. So I'm going on that issue, and I'm going to speak and vote against it.
Thank you, Councillor Gross.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a clarifying question, please?
Yes, you may.
Just in regards to the demolition, is it possible that the officers could speak to that?
Yeah, I'll allow that if someone could just quickly speak to the demolition. I guess it relates, Councillor Baxter, to what VCAT said previously.
Is there an actual question?
Sorry, apologies. Basically, Councillor Gross has questioned some of the advice that I have had.
That's not true.
Sorry, Councillor Gross.
Sorry. Councillor Gross has a different view of some of the advice that I've heard. I didn't mean to have a go at you. But I'll just say I would like that cleared up in terms of what is the status of the decision we're making with regard to the demolition, and what are our options with regards to the VCAT decision that has been made.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the tribunal is not a jurisdiction of President, so what the tribunal has found before is guidance, but it is not binding in the same way as if it was a decision through a higher court. Having said that, they have considered a range of factors in arriving at their decision, including discussion of structural soundness, and our officers in our building department have concurred with reports that have been submitted on that issue of structural soundness. It is before the council to decide on the demolition question afresh, but there is a need to consider what's gone before.
Thank you. Would any other councillor like to speak? No. In that case, Councillor Brand, would you like to close?
I would. The modernisation of our suburbs is a really it's a difficult thing. It's a beast sometimes, and I think that this process has been quite a good example of how we can move from something very unsuitable, with all parties sort of struggling to find a foothold in the process, but to move towards something which I think has fallen into the category of a good building in this place. And certainly far, far better than what was proposed, far, far, far better. And I certainly, one of the submitters with this one, I think this is a delightful building and a model of how you might do it in this area. I might even like it better than what's been applied for. But I think that what's before us has moved towards that a long way. And certainly to the point of being acceptable, and I find aspects of it admirable. I think Lawson Street is one of our prettiest streets in the whole city, and I feel this will sit well in Lawson Street amongst its trees. I regret the demolition of any period building, but I think that it's that option is long gone, and I think that our officer has just confirmed that. So look, nobody's saying this is ideal, but I'm saying it's so much closer to the ideal. Thanks to the process that the applicants, the community and council have been through, and I'm glad that I had the opportunity to, I guess, shore up something of it that will, I think will be, I think you can get to like it probably in the end. I think Lawson Street can carry it, so I'm happy to be moving it.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. I shall put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? That is carried. Item 6.3, the Planning Permits Delegates Report. We have no speakers to this item. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? There being no questions, do I have a mover? Councillor Voss. Second, Councillor Copsey. Councillor Voss, would you like to speak to this item? Councillor Copsey, would you like to speak to this item? Would any other councillor like to speak to this item? There being no speakers, I shall put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? That's carried. Item 7, urgent business. Councillors, are there any items of urgent business? No. we shall move on to item 8, confidential matters. Councillors, we have no confidential matters tonight. There being no further business, I declare the meeting closed at 7:31. Thank you.